The wind howled across the battered coastline of Port Haven, a small town still reeling from the aftermath of Hurricane Lila. Debris littered the streets, shattered boards, twisted metal, and the remnants of homes that once stood proud. Amid the chaos, a golden Labrador Retriever named Rex bounded through the wreckage, his nose low to the ground, ears perked, and eyes sharp with purpose. His vest, emblazoned with search and rescue, flapped against his muscular frame as he navigated the rubble. At his side was Valeria Monroe, a woman whose name carried weight in the world of canine rescue. Tall, poised, and dressed in a crisp navy jacket, she barked commands with the precision of a drill sergeant. Rex left. "Check the pile," she shouted, her voice cutting through the storm's lingering echoes. Rex didn't hesitate. He darted toward a collapsed shed, sniffing intently until a faint whimper reached his ears. With a sharp bark, he signaled Valeria, who rushed over with a team of volunteers. Minutes later, they pulled a child from the debris, a muddy, trembling boy who clung to Rex's neck as if the dog were his lifeline. The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, and Valeria soaked in the praise. To the world, she and Rex were a perfect team, the brilliant trainer and her champion dog, a duo that had saved dozens of lives across the country. Rex had even won the National Rescue Dog Championship 2 years running, a title that made him a legend among trainers and a golden ticket for Valeria's career. But that day, something went wrong. As Rex leaped over a jagged beam to reach another trapped survivor, the ground shifted beneath him. A slab of concrete gave way, crashing down on his hind leg with a sickening crunch. He yelped, a sound so raw it silenced the crowd, and crumpled to the ground. Valeria's face twisted, not with concern, but with frustration. "Get up, Rex," she snapped, but he couldn't. Blood seeped from his paw, and his whimpers filled the air as medics rushed to his side. The vet's diagnosis was swift and brutal: a torn ligament, months of recovery, maybe more. For Valeria, it was a death sentence, not for Rex's life, but for his usefulness. That night, under the dim lights of a makeshift tent, Valeria paced, her polished boots clicking against the floor. "I can't waste time on a broken dog," she muttered to her assistant, her voice cold as steel. "He's done." By morning, Rex was gone, not euthanized, but handed off to a rural shelter hours away, a place known for overcrowded kennels and little oversight. Valeria didn't look back. To her, Rex was a tool, and a damaged tool had no place in her world. Miles away, in the sleepy town of Willow Creek, 12-year-old Isabel Carter sat on her porch, flipping through a tattered magazine about rescue dogs. Her dark hair fell messily over her shoulders, and her hazel eyes sparkled with dreams of one day training a dog like the one she read about. Heroes who pulled people from floods and fires. Her family didn't have much. Her mom, Maria, worked double shifts at the diner since the factory closed, and their small house creaked with every gust of wind. But Isabel's heart was big, and her spirit was unbreakable. One Saturday, while biking past the old county shelter, she spotted him. A golden Labrador curled in a cramped kennel, his fur matted, his eyes dull. The sign above his cage read, "Rex, owner surrendered." Isabel stopped, her breath catching. She didn't know his history, but something about him, the way he lifted his head, despite the limp in his leg, told her he was special. She raced home, bursting through the door. "Mom, there's a dog at the shelter. He's hurt, and he needs us." Maria sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Honey, we can barely afford groceries. A dog's too much." But Isabel's pleading eyes wore her down. "Just water and some leftovers," Isabel promised. "I'll figure out the rest." That was the beginning of Rex's second chance, and Isabel's journey to prove that even a broken hero could rise again. The shelter smelled of damp concrete and despair, a cacophony of barks echoing off the rusted cages. Isabel stood in front of Rex's kennel, her small hands gripping the chain-link fence. Up close, he was even more striking than she'd realized. His golden coat, though dirty, shimmered faintly in the flickering light, and his broad chest hinted at the strength he'd once carried. But his eyes told a different story. They were deep brown pools of resignation, as if he'd accepted that this cold, cramped space was his new reality. His right hind leg was tucked awkwardly beneath him, the fur matted with dried blood and grime. "Hey, buddy," Isabel whispered, crouching down to his level. Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't move. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a dented metal bowl she'd swiped from the kitchen, filling it with water from a bottle. Sliding it through the bars, she watched as he sniffed it hesitantly before lapping it up with slow, deliberate sips. "See? I'm not so bad," she said, her voice soft but steady. For the first time, Rex met her gaze, and something flickered in those tired eyes. A spark, faint but real. Getting him out wasn't easy. The shelter worker, a gruff man with a stained shirt and a permanent scowl, barely looked up from his clipboard. "That one's a surrender. No adoption fee, but he's banged up. Probably won't last long out there." Isabel's stomach twisted, but she squared her shoulders. "I'll take him. My mom's okay with it." It was a half-truth. Maria had only agreed to think about it, but Isabel wasn't leaving without him. After a shrug and a scribbled signature, Rex was hers, limping beside her on a frayed leash she'd borrowed from a neighbor. The walk home was slow. Rex moved with a halting gait, his injured leg dragging slightly with every step. Isabel kept her pace gentle, talking to him the whole way. "You're gonna love it at my place. It's not fancy, but we've got a yard, and I'll make you a bed out of my old sleeping bag." She didn't know if he understood, but his ears flicked toward her voice, and that was enough. When they reached the weathered clapboard house on Elm Street, Maria was waiting on the porch, arms crossed and brow furrowed. "Isabel Marie Carter, what have you done?" she asked, her tone a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Rex sat at Isabel's feet, his head tilted as if apologizing for the trouble. "Mom, look at him," Isabel pleaded. "He's hurt, and nobody else wanted him. I can fix him up. Please." Maria's gaze softened as she studied the dog, his matted fur, his quiet dignity despite the limp. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "1 week. If he's too much, he goes back. And you're cleaning up after him." That night, Isabel turned the corner of their tiny living room into Rex's sanctuary. She spread out her sleeping bag, fluffed it with an old pillow, and set a bowl of leftover chicken scraps beside it. Rex sniffed the food warily before devouring it, his tail giving a single, cautious wag. Isabel sat cross-legged beside him, brushing his fur with an old comb she'd found in the bathroom. Each knot she untangled felt like a small victory, a step toward bringing him back to life. "You're not broken," she murmured, her fingers tracing the scars on his leg. "You're just resting." The days that followed were a blur of small battles. Rex's leg was worse than Isabel had thought, swollen and tender, with a limp that made every step look painful. She spent her allowance on a cheap bottle of antiseptic from the corner store, cleaning the wound with a damp rag while Rex lay still, trusting her despite the sting. Feeding him was harder. Maria's shifts at the diner barely covered their bills, let alone dog food. So Isabel scavenged scraps from neighbors and traded chores for handfuls of kibble. The townsfolk whispered as she passed, some with pity, others with scorn. "That mutt's a lost cause," old Mrs. Jenkins muttered from her rocking chair. "Girls wasting her time." But Isabel didn't care. She saw something in Rex they couldn't, a quiet strength, a flicker of the hero he'd once been. She started taking him on short walks around the yard, coaxing him to move despite the pain. "Just a little farther, okay?" she'd say, holding a piece of bread as bait. At first, he'd collapse after a few steps, panting heavily. But day by day, he pushed a little more, his limp easing as muscle memory kicked in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden streaks across the grass, Rex took a tentative leap to catch a stick Isabel tossed. He landed awkwardly, but his tail wagged furiously, and Isabel laughed, tears pricking her eyes. "That's it, Rex. You've still got it." Word of her project spread through Willow Creek, and not everyone was dismissive. Don Julian, a grizzled retiree who'd once trained search dogs for the fire department, stopped by one afternoon. His gray hair was cropped short, and he leaned on a cane, but his eyes lit up when he saw Rex. "Heard you've got a fighter there," he said, nodding toward the Labrador, who was gnawing a bone Isabel had scavenged. "He looks like he's been through hell." Isabel wiped her hands on her jeans, suddenly shy. "He was abandoned. I'm just trying to help him get better." Don Julian crouched beside Rex, running a hand along his flank. "This ain't no ordinary dog. See that build? That focus? He's got rescue in his blood. What's his story?" Isabel hesitated, then spilled what little she knew. Surrendered, injured, left to rot. Don Julian's jaw tightened. People throw away good dogs like trash. But you're doing right by him, kid. Takes guts. He stood, brushing off his knees. If you need tips, I'm around. Trained my share of champs back in the day. Isabel smiled, hope blooming in her chest. Thanks, Mr. Julian. I might take you up on that. Weeks turned into months, and Rex began to change. His coat regained its golden sheen, his limp faded to a slight hitch, and his eyes, once dull, sparkled with curiosity. Isabel built a routine, mornings for walks, afternoons for play, evenings for brushing and talking. She'd sit with him under the oak tree in their yard, telling him about her dreams. I want to be a rescuer someday, like the ones on TV. You could help me, right? Rex would nudge her hand with his wet nose, a silent promise. One day, flipping through her magazine, Isabel stumbled on an article about the Coastal Canine Challenge, a regional competition for rescue dogs held an hour's drive away in Bayview. The photos showed labs and shepherds leaping over obstacles, sniffing out hidden victims, and racing against the clock. Her heart raced. Rex, this is it, she whispered, tracing the page with her finger. You were made for this. We could show everyone what you can do. But doubt crept in. He wasn't fully healed, and she was just a kid with no training gear, no money, no team. Still, the idea took root, stubborn and fierce. That night, as Maria chopped onions for dinner, Isabel made her pitch. Mom, there's this contest. Rex could win it. I know he could. He's getting stronger every day. Maria paused, knife hovering. Isabel, we can't afford a trip like that. And what if he gets hurt again? Her voice was gentle but firm, shadowed by worry. Isabel clenched her fists. I'll find a way. I'll mow lawns, wash cars, whatever it takes. He deserves a chance, Mom. Please. Maria looked at her daughter, seeing the fire in her eyes, the same fire she'd had before life wore her down. All right, she said finally. But it's on you, honey. I'll help where I can, but don't push him too hard. Isabel grinned, hugging her mom tight. Outside, Rex barked, as if he knew something big was coming. Under the starlit sky, a girl and her dog stood on the edge of something new, a chance to reclaim a legacy, to prove that heroes don't fade, they fight back. The backyard of the Carter house wasn't much, just a patchy square of grass hemmed in by a sagging wooden fence. But to Isabel, it became a training ground. The Coastal Canine Challenge was 6 weeks away, and every spare minute she had went into preparing Rex. She scavenged old tires from the junkyard down the road, stacking them into makeshift hurdles, and borrowed a whistle from her school's gym class to mimic the sharp commands she'd seen in YouTube videos of rescue dog trials. Her tools were crude, her knowledge patchy, but her determination was ironclad. Rex, over, she called one crisp October morning, pointing to a low stack of tires. He trotted toward it, his gait smoother now, but still cautious. With a huff, he leaped, clearing the obstacle with a wobble that sent one tire rolling. Isabel clapped wildly. Good boy. We'll get there. Rex's tail wagged, a golden blur against the dew-soaked grass, and he bounded back to her, nudging her hand for a treat. She offered a piece of stale biscuit. Her budget didn't stretch to fancy rewards, and he gobbled it down, eyes bright with trust. Training wasn't all triumphs. Some days, Rex's leg buckled mid-jump, and he'd sprawl in the dirt, whining softly. Isabel would kneel beside him, stroking his ears, fighting the lump in her throat. It's okay, buddy. We'll take it slow. She'd learned from a library book that labs like him needed time to rebuild strength after injuries. So she adjusted, shorter sessions, more rest, gentle stretches she'd coax him through with soothing words. Progress crept forward, inch by inch. His leaps grew steadier, his stamina longer, and soon he was clearing 2 tires at a time, landing with a proud shake of his head. Don Julian became a regular visitor, hobbling over with his cane and a thermos of coffee. He'd sit on an old lawn chair, watching with a critical eye. He's got heart, kid, he said one afternoon, as Rex sniffed out a sock Isabel had hidden under a bucket, a trick to sharpen his scent skills. But rescue works more than jumping. He needs to trust you in chaos. Isabel wiped sweat from her brow. What do you mean? Don Julian sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. Back when I ran dogs, my old girl Luna saved a hiker in a blizzard. Took her hours, but she trusted me to guide her. You and Rex need that bond. Unbreakable, no matter what. He started bringing gear, a frayed harness, a battered stopwatch, even a whistle of his own. He taught Isabel how to signal Rex with sharp blasts, how to read his body language. Ears up for focus, tail low for doubt. One day, he rigged a pile of cardboard boxes to simulate rubble, tossing a rag inside as a victim. "Find it, Rex," Isabel commanded, and after a moment's hesitation, Rex dove in, nosing through the mess until he emerged, rag in his jaws, tail wagging like a metronome. Don Julian chuckled. "That's the spirit. He's remembering who he is." Maria watched from the kitchen window, her skepticism softening. She'd lost her husband, Isabel's dad, to a factory accident years ago, and since then, she'd built walls around her hope. But seeing her daughter with Rex, that fierce spark in her eyes, cracked those walls. One evening, she slipped Isabel a crumpled 20 from her tips. "For 𝐥𝐤𝐤𝐿, she said gruffly. "Don't tell me no." Isabel hugged her, whispering, "Thanks, Mom. You'll see he's gonna shine." The bond between Isabel and Rex deepened with every sunrise. He'd greet her at dawn with a wet nose to her cheek, sleep at her feet while she did homework, and follow her like a shadow. She'd talk to him for hours, about school bullies, her dad's old fishing stories, her dream of saving lives. "You get me, don't you?" she'd say, and he'd rest his head on her knee, a silent yes. Once, when a thunderstorm rattled the house, Rex pressed against her, trembling but steady, as if guarding her from the chaos. She realized then, he wasn't just her project. He was her family. Word of Rex's comeback trickled through Willow Creek. Kids peeked over the fence during training, whispering about the rescue dog, while adults swapped theories at the diner. "Heard he was some big-shot hero before," one said. "Bet the girl's dreaming too big," another scoffed. Isabel ignored them, but the chatter reached further than she knew, straight to Valeria Monroe. Valeria sat in her sleek Atlanta apartment, scrolling through a local news site on her tablet. A grainy photo caught her eye, a golden Labrador mid-leap, a girl in a faded hoodie cheering him on. The headline read, "Willow Creek Kid Revives Mystery Rescue Dog for Coastal Challenge." Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. She'd recognize that dog anywhere. Rex, her discarded champion. Her mind raced. She'd moved on, training a new shepherd for the national circuit, but Rex's name still carried weight. If he was winning again, that glory could be hers to reclaim. She drove to Willow Creek the next day, her black SUV gleaming against the town's dusty roads. Pulling up to the Carter house, she stepped out, all sharp angles and designer boots, her auburn hair pinned in a flawless bun. Isabel was in the yard, tossing a ball for Rex, when the shadow fell across her. She turned, heart sinking as she recognized the woman from old TV clips, the cold-eyed trainer who'd once owned her dog. "Can I help you?" Isabel asked, clutching the ball. Rex tensed, his ears flattening as he pressed against her leg. Valeria's smile was thin, practiced. "That's my dog," she said, nodding at Rex. "I surrendered him months ago, but seeing him now, well, he's clearly valuable again. I'd like him back." Isabel's grip tightened, her voice steady despite the tremor inside. "You left him to die? He's mine now." Valeria's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Sweetheart, I've got papers proving ownership. He's a champion, not some backyard pet. Hand him over, or I'll make this legal." Rex growled low, a sound Isabel had never heard, his body shifting to shield her. Valeria stepped back, surprised, but her eyes narrowed. "You've got a week to think it over," she said, turning on her heel. "Don't test me, kid." The SUV roared off, leaving dust and dread in its wake. That night, Isabel sat with Rex under the oak, her fingers buried in his fur. "She can't take you," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "You're my hero, not hers." Rex licked her cheek, his warmth a quiet vow. But fear not at her. Papers, laws, things she didn't understand loomed like storm clouds. She needed help, and fast. Don Julian showed up the next morning, his truck rattling to a stop. "Heard about your visitor," he said, leaning on his cane. "Valeria Monroe's a shark. But I've got a buddy at the shelter. Says abandonment voids her claim if we can prove neglect. Got photos of how bad he was." Isabel nodded, pulling out her phone. Snaps of Rex's early days, thin and scarred. "Good," Don Julian said. "We'll fight her, kid. You and Rex deserve that shot in Bayview." The clock was ticking. 5 weeks to the challenge, and now a battle off the field. Isabel looked at Rex, his steady gaze meeting hers. "We're not giving up," she said, resolve hardening. "Not now, not ever." Rex barked, sharp and sure, as if he'd fight the world with her. And maybe, just maybe, he would. The days after Valeria's visit were a storm of their own. Isabel couldn't shake the image of that sleek SUV, the cold certainty in Valeria's voice, or the way Rex had growled, a sound born of memory, not just instinct. She threw herself into training, pushing harder than ever, as if every leap Rex made could build a wall between them and Valeria's claim. The Coastal Canine Challenge was 4 weeks away, a deadline that loomed like a thunderhead, but now it wasn't just about proving Rex's worth. It was about keeping him. Don Julian became her rock. He'd show up each morning with a thermos and a plan, his gravelly voice cutting through her panic. "She's got papers, sure," he said one day, watching Rex weave through a line of buckets Isabel had set up as an obstacle course. "But neglect's a legal gray area. We've got those photos, him half-starved, like a mess. That's evidence she didn't care for him. Might not hold up in court, but it'll make her think twice." Isabel nodded, her hands shaky as she adjusted Rex's harness. "What if it's not enough?" Don Julian's eyes softened. "Then we fight dirty. She wants a PR war, we'll give her one. People love an underdog story." Maria pitched in too, her quiet support growing louder. She'd overheard the neighbors gossiping about Valeria's visit. Willow Creek was small, and news traveled fast, and it lit a fire under her. "That woman's got no right," she muttered one night, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. "Abandoning him like that, then waltzing back? I'll call in sick if I have to. Drive you to Bayview myself." Isabel grinned, handing her a towel. "Thanks, Mom. We're gonna win this, for Rex." Training ramped up. Rex was stronger now, his limp barely noticeable as he bounded over hurdles and sniffed out hidden toys with laser focus. Isabel added complexity, blind corners, loud noises from a borrowed radio, even a shallow kiddie pool to mimic water rescue. He thrived, his tail a constant wag, his eyes locked on her every command. One afternoon, Don Julian brought an old fire hose, rigging it into a tug-of-war game. "Strength and grit," he said. "That's what rescuers need." Rex clamped down, pulling with a ferocity that surprised them both, and Isabel laughed as she stumbled forward, muddy and triumphant. But Valeria wasn't idle. A week after her first visit, a letter arrived, official, stamped, delivered by a stern-faced courier. Isabel's hands trembled as she opened it, Maria peering over her shoulder. Notice of intent to reclaim property. It read, followed by legalese about ownership rights and a demand to surrender Rex within 7 days or face court action. A photocopy of his registration was attached, Valeria's name in bold. Maria cursed under her breath. "She's serious." Isabel's throat tightened. She can't have him. She just can't. Don Julian swung by that evening, his truck kicking up gravel. He scanned the letter, his jaw tight. "She's bluffing, partly. She's got the law on her side, but it's shaky if we push back. I called my shelter guy. He's digging up records of Rex's intake, condition, dates, all of it. We've got a shot." He handed Isabel a flyer for the challenge. "Win that, and the whole state'll see what she threw away. Public pressure's a weapon, kid." Isabel clutched the flyer, resolve hardening. "Then we win." Valeria returned on the 6th day, her SUV rolling up just as Isabel and Rex finished a training run. The sun was low, painting the sky in streaks of orange, and Rex panted happily at Isabel's side, a stick in his jaws. Valeria stepped out, this time with a man in tow, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cheap suit and a badge that read, County Animal Control. Isabel's heart sank. "Time's up," Valeria said, her voice smooth as ice. "I gave you a chance to do this easy. Now it's official." Rex dropped the stick, his body stiffening as he pressed against Isabel's leg. She squared her shoulders, fighting the tremble in her voice. "You don't deserve him. You left him to rot. I saw how bad he was. I saved him." Valeria's eyes narrowed, but the man stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Miss, I've got an order here. Registration's clear. This dog's hers unless you've got proof otherwise." Isabel's mind raced. The photos were on her phone, the shelter records still pending. Don Julian hadn't gotten them yet. She was cornered. "He's not just a dog," she said, voice breaking. "He's my partner. You can't take him. Rex barked, sharp and defiant, his hackles up. The man hesitated, glancing at Valeria. Look, I don't want trouble, he started, but Valeria cut him off. Enough. Load him up. She reached for Rex's collar, but he lunged forward, snapping just shy of her hand. She recoiled, shock flashing across her face. Isabel grabbed his harness, holding tight. He doesn't want you. Don't you get it? The standoff stretched, tense and silent, until tires crunched on the road. Don Julian's truck screeched to a halt, and he climbed out, waving a manila envelope. Hold it, he shouted, limping over. Got the shelter logs, signed by the intake vet. Says he was malnourished, untreated injury, abandoned for weeks before Isabel took him. That's neglect, lady. You try taking him now, and I'll have every news station in Georgia on your ass. He thrust the papers at the animal control officer, who skimmed them, frowning. Valeria's composure cracked, her lips a thin line. This isn't over, she hissed, but the officer shook his head. Ma'am, this complicates things. I can't enforce without a judge's ruling now. He tipped his hat to Isabel. Keep those records handy, kid. Valeria glared, then stormed back to her SUV, slamming the door. The engine roared as she peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust and a fragile victory. Isabel sank to her knees, burying her face in Rex's fur. We did it, she whispered. He licked her cheek, warm and steady. Don Julian clapped her shoulder. For now, she'll be back. Count on it. Focus on that challenge. It's your best shot. Isabel nodded, wiping her eyes. 3 weeks left. They'd be ready. The sky darkened over Willow Creek 2 weeks later, a late fall storm brewing on the horizon. Isabel and Rex were in the yard, practicing a water retrieval drill, when the first raindrops fell, fat, heavy, relentless. By nightfall, the creek behind town swelled, muddy water lapping at its banks. The radio crackled with warnings, flash flood risk, stay indoors. Maria paced, peering out the window. This isn't good, she muttered. Isabel hugged Rex, unease prickling her skin. By morning, the town was a war zone. The creek had burst, flooding streets and swallowing yards. Sirens wailed as volunteers scrambled to help stranded families. Isabel watched from the porch, Rex at her side, his ears perked at every shout. Don Julian called, voice tight. Bridge on Maples out. People trapped. You and Rex up for it. Isabel didn't hesitate. We're in. They reached the flood zone in Maria's beat-up sedan, rain hammering the roof. The scene was chaos, water up to car hoods, debris swirling, shouts echoing. A woman waved frantically from a rooftop, her kids clinging to her. Help! We're stuck! Isabel grabbed Rex's harness, her pulse racing. You ready, boy? He barked, eyes locked on the water, every inch the rescuer he'd been born to be. She waded in, the current tugging at her legs, Rex swimming beside her. They reached the house, and he scrambled onto a floating plank, sniffing for a path. With a sharp bark, he guided her to a ladder half-submerged, access to the roof. Isabel climbed, coaxing the family down one by one, Rex nudging them towards safety. As the last kid reached solid ground, a scream pierced the air. Across the street, a black SUV spun in the flood, slamming into a tree. Valeria's SUV. Isabel froze, rain stinging her eyes. Valeria was inside, slumped against the wheel, water rising fast. Rex barked, urgent, and bolted toward the wreck, swimming with fierce determination. Isabel followed, heart pounding. Hold on, she yelled, reaching the vehicle. The door was jammed, the window cracked. Rex pawed at it, whining, as Isabel yanked with all her strength. It gave, and she hauled Valeria out, half-conscious, coughing water. Rex grabbed her jacket in his jaws, dragging her to higher ground as the SUV sank. Valeria gasped, eyes wide with shock, staring at Rex, then Isabel. You why? She croaked. Isabel met her gaze, steady despite the chaos. Because he's a hero, and heroes don't give up on anyone. Rex stood guard, soaked and unshaken, as the storm raged on. The floodwaters roared around them, a muddy torrent swallowing everything in its path. Isabel knelt beside Valeria on the soggy embankment, her hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. Rex stood firm, his golden fur plastered to his frame, water dripping from his muzzle as he kept watch over the woman he'd just pulled from the wreckage. Valeria coughed, her designer jacket torn and soaked, her auburn hair clinging to her pale face. She stared at Rex, then Isabel, her gray eyes clouded with something new. Confusion, maybe shame. "Why'd you do it?" she rasped again, voice barely audible over the storm. Rain hammered down, blurring the world into a gray haze, but Isabel's answer cut through clear and steady. "Because he wouldn't let me leave you there. And I wouldn't either." She wiped her face, smearing mud across her cheek. "You don't get to decide who's worth saving." Rex nudged Valeria's hand, a low whine escaping him, and for a moment, she flinched as if his touch burned. Then her fingers curled into his wet fur, hesitant, searching. Sirens wailed closer, red and blue lights flashing through the downpour. Volunteers swarmed the scene, wrapping blankets around the family Isabel had rescued, shouting orders over the wind. A paramedic rushed to Valeria, checking her pulse, shining a light in her eyes. "You're lucky, ma'am. Concussion, some cuts, could have been worse." Valeria nodded weakly, her gaze drifting back to Rex. Isabel stood, pulling her hood tighter, but Valeria grabbed her wrist. "Wait," she said, voice cracking. I'm sorry. For everything." Isabel paused, rain dripping from her chin, then nodded once. "Prove it," she said simply, turning to help Rex shake off the water. The storm didn't relent, but the rescue effort did. Isabel and Rex worked until dusk, guiding stranded neighbors to safety, sniffing out paths through the flood. Word spread fast. Willow Creek's mystery dog and the kid who'd brought him back were heroes. Don Julian found them as the rain slowed, his cane sinking into the mud. "Knew you had it in you," he said, clapping Isabel's shoulder. "Both of you." Rex barked, tail wagging despite the exhaustion, and Isabel grinned, bone-tired but glowing. Maria pulled up in the sedan, tears mixing with rain on her face as she hugged her daughter. "I'm so proud, honey. So damn proud." Valeria didn't vanish this time. She spent the night in the local clinic, battered but alive, and by morning, the flood had receded, leaving Willow Creek a sodden mess of mud and debris. Isabel was cleaning Rex's paws in the yard when Valeria's SUV, towed and patched, rolled up again. Isabel tensed, ready for another fight, but Valeria stepped out alone, no suit, no badge, just jeans and a plain sweater. Her face was bruised, her eyes red-rimmed, and she carried a manila folder instead of a threat. "I'm not here to take him," she said, raising a hand as Isabel opened her mouth. "I mean it. I saw what he did, what you both did. I don't deserve him." She handed over the folder. "Registration, vet records, all of it. I'm signing him over to you. Legally." Isabel took it, stunned, flipping through papers stamped with Rex's name and her own now listed as owner. "Why now?" she asked, wary. Valeria looked at Rex, who sat calmly at Isabel's side, his ears perked. "Because I was wrong," she said, voice low. "I treated him like a trophy, not a partner. You gave him what I never did, a reason to keep going. I owe you both more than I can repay." She swallowed hard, glancing away. "I've spent years chasing wins, thinking that's what mattered. But yesterday, when he pulled me out, I saw what I'd lost. Not just him, but who I used to be." Isabel studied her, the hard edges of her anger softening. "He's not a prize to win back," she said. "He's family. If you mean this, it's not about owing us. It's about doing better." Valeria nodded, a faint, shaky smile breaking through. "I want to try, if you'll let me." Rex tilted his head, sniffing her outstretched hand, then licked it once, a cautious truce. Isabel exhaled. "Okay, but it's his call too." The Coastal Canine Challenge came a week later, the flood's aftermath still etched into Willow Creek streets. Isabel and Rex arrived in Bayview with Maria and Don Julian in tow, the sedan packed with borrowed gear and a nervous buzz. The event buzzed with sleek dogs and polished trainers, a stark contrast to Isabel's muddy sneakers and Rex's patched harness. Whispers followed them, some curious, some mocking, but Isabel kept her chin up, Rex's steady presence grounding her. The course was brutal. Obstacle runs, scent trials, a water rescue simulation. Rex flew through it, his leaps clean, his nose sharp, every move synced with Isabel's commands. Spectators leaned forward, murmuring as the nobody team racked up points. In the final round, Rex dove into a murky pool, retrieving a dummy in record time, emerging with a shake that sprayed the crowd. The scoreboard flashed. First place. Cheers erupted, and Isabel dropped to her knees, hugging Rex as he licked her face, tail a golden blur. Don Julian hooped, Maria wiped her eyes, and even the rival trainers clapped. Valeria was there, not in the stands but at the edge of the field, quiet and unassuming. She approached after the ceremony, a small medal in hand, a participant's token she'd earned years ago with Rex. "Thought he should have this," she said, pinning it to his harness. Rex sniffed it, then nudged her, and she smiled. "A real one this time." "Good boy," she whispered, stepping back as Isabel lifted the trophy. Months later, Willow Creek found a new rhythm. Isabel and Rex trained as a rescue team, certified with Don Julian's help, answering calls for lost hikers and flood victims. Maria took extra shifts to fund their gear, her pride in her daughter a quiet fuel. And Valeria? She didn't reclaim her old life. She stayed, volunteering with the local shelter, training strays with a gentleness she'd forgotten she had. She and Isabel worked side by side sometimes, not friends exactly, but allies bound by a shared redemption. One evening, as spring painted the hills green, Isabel sat with Rex on the porch, the sun dipping low. His metal glinted, his fur warm against her. "You're my hero, you know that?" she said, scratching his ears. He rested his head on her lap, eyes half closed, content. Across town, Valeria fed a skinny mutt at the shelter, her hands steady, her heart lighter. And in that quiet moment, Rex's legacy stretched beyond trophies or rescues. It was a bridge, mending what was broken, proving that second chances could heal more than one soul. The wind rustled the trees, carrying whispers of new beginnings. Isabel smiled, dreaming of their next adventure, knowing Rex would be there, steady as ever, her partner through it all.